Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Jessica carefully placed the bottle of red wine on the table. Mark looked away from his phone, but not before his gaze went from the screen to her hands. She filled his glass, then her own, her gaze lingering slightly on the stream of wine that swirled down the sides of the glass, as if pretending it was an ordinary evening. And yet something in her movements betrayed tension, as if the words she was about to say were already simmering inside her, but couldn't quite get off her tongue. "You know what I've been thinking?" she finally said, leaning on the edge of the table. Mark looked up. Her tone was light, as if she were ordering a new couch. "What?" Mark raised his glass to his lips, clearly not expecting anything special. "You and I are fine, aren't we?" She smiled. 8 years, after all. "Yeah, it's not bad." He smiled back, a little tired. 8 years of marriage had, in fact, made everything predictable. He could guess her phrases, her moods, her gestures. At least it seemed that way to him. Jessica reached for her plate, as if considering how best to make her point. "So, I was thinking that dash," she paused, forcing Mark to set his fork aside. "What if we tried something new?" "New?" he repeated with a slight smile, expecting to hear something like a trip to Europe or dance lessons. "Do you want to get a dog?" Jessica shook her head, smiling, but her eyes darkened, as if something inside had already flared up and she was about to let it out. "Not really. I'm thinking maybe we could have, well, let's say one night of freedom. No repercussions." Mark frowned, but the smile still held on his face, as if he thought it was a joke. But Jessica didn't look away. The smile disappeared on its own. "Are you serious?" he asked, pushing his glass away. She only nodded, as if that nod was supposed to explain everything. "Why?" He leaned back in his chair, trying to understand her logic. "We're fine. We're good." "Why do you want that?" "It doesn't mean we're not good, Mark." Her voice was a little quieter, but there was a hardness to it. "It's just, like wine. If you drink the same thing, even the good stuff, eventually it becomes ordinary." "Uh-huh." Mark tried to grin, but it was unconvincing. "So you're suggesting?" "Just one night," she interrupted. "No rules. No questions. We only do it if we both want to. No pressure. No judgment. And then we forget. Forever." Mark stared at her, not knowing what to say. He tried to find something in her face that would tell him it was just an odd joke, but her gaze was serious. The look of someone who had been nurturing the idea for a long time and had finally decided to voice it. "Do you really want to do this?" He said it slowly, as if testing her words against his own. "Yes." Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled slightly. "Just, let's give it a try." Mark frowned, staring at her for a few more long seconds. Then he brought the glass to his lips and took a big sip. He needed time to think about this. "What if something goes wrong?" he asked at last. "Nothing will go wrong if we're both honest." Jessica moved forward a little, touching his arm. "We trust each other, don't we?" He stared at her hand, at her face, at the slightly trembling lashes. Something in her tone, in the way she spoke, made him wonder. She didn't look frightened, but she wasn't completely sure either. She was waiting for his decision, but she wasn't trying to push him into it. This ease, this certainty that they had everything under control, none of it gave him cause for conflict. On the contrary, it sounded almost innocent. "Almost." "Okay," he said, leaning back in his chair. "If that's what you really want." "Okay." Jessica relaxed a little, as if she'd been sitting on a taut string all evening. She smiled and raised her glass. "To our experiment?" she offered, a little flirtatiously, but there was a spark in her eyes. Mark didn't know what exactly he was feeling at that moment. Maybe a slight jealousy, maybe excitement, or maybe something he couldn't yet name. But he raised his glass. To the experiment. The bar he found himself in had no name he could remember. Just an ordinary place with dark wood paneling, soft lights, clinking glasses, and the lazy hum of voices. Neither too flashy nor too cheap. Something in between, much like his mood. Mark took a sip of whiskey and looked at his phone again. There were no messages. The screen went blank, as if mocking him. Jessica wasn't texting anything. That was annoying. Not because he was waiting for a report, not because he wanted control. It was just, she always wrote. Even if she was late at the store, even if she was out to dinner with her friends, even if she just wanted to say goodnight. It's what they were used to. That's how they lived. And now nothing. He sighed, rubbed his face with his palms, and looked up. The bar was full of women. Some had already caught his eye, the dark-haired one in the tight dress, laughing at the words of the man sitting next to her. A blonde at the counter, scrutinizing her reflection in the mirror. A couple of women in the corner, chatting and occasionally casting glances in his direction. He knew that if he wanted to, this evening could end differently. It would be worth it just to catch someone's eye, linger a little longer, offer them a drink. It required no effort, but the desire wasn't there. He expected something else, perhaps a lightness, perhaps some strange excitement, but there was only emptiness inside. It all felt fake. It was as if he were on a stage, with other people's roles playing around him, whose lines he knew in advance. The telephone remained motionless. He raised his hand, called the bartender over. More? He nodded at his glass. No. Check. The bartender raised an eyebrow in surprise, but said nothing. Mark left the bills on the counter and walked out. It was cool outside. The air tugged at his skin, bringing the smells of wet asphalt, the evening city, other people's conversations, cigarette smoke. Cars moved in a stream, people laughed, hugged, someone lit a cigarette, someone hurried to a meeting. Mark shoved his hands in his pockets, opened his phone, checked his messages. It was still empty. He dialed her number. The dial tone was slow. 1, 2, 3. She didn't answer. He stood there for another minute, staring at the screen. Then he put the phone in his pocket and headed for his car. The drive home seemed longer than usual. He turned on the radio, but the music was annoying. Turn it off. Jessica still hadn't texted. Where was she now? Who was she with? The thought prickled somewhere deep in his stomach like something sticky and cold. They'd made a deal. But what if? Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter. He drove down familiar streets, pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine. The house greeted him with darkness. It was quiet inside. He tossed his keys on the nightstand, took off his jacket, walked into the living room, went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, but didn't want anything. He poured some water, took a sip. Somewhere in the distance, the refrigerator was humming. He looked at his phone again. The screen remained blank. He lay back in bed, closed his eyes, couldn't sleep. The clock showed 2 in the morning. The phone remained motionless. Anxiety was slowly but surely growing inside. Mark heard the key turn in the lock and raised his head. It was not yet dawn. The light from the hallway streaked across the dark floorboards. The sound of footsteps was quiet, but he recognized her gait. She appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled, eyes unfocused. He expected to see a slight, tired smile, or at least the familiar motion of her trying to untangle a strand with one hand, but there was none of that. You're back, he said, trying to hide his surprise. Jessica paused for a second, met his gaze, but immediately turned away and went on into the bedroom. Without dropping the customary hello, without explaining why she'd returned so early. Her silence made him sit up straighter. How'd it go? He asked, feeling the second stretch out. It was as if she hadn't heard. But when she was about to leave the bedroom to head for the bathroom, she answered, I'm fine. Her voice sounded quiet, as if she didn't want him to hear anything at all. Normal? He rose to his feet. What do you mean, normal? Did everything go as planned? She stopped, shoulders slightly raised, head lowered, then nodded slowly. Yes, as planned. Her voice shook, but she didn't turn around. The rumble of water came in. Her silhouette disappeared behind the bathroom door. He heard the water in the shower rumble. Mark stood in the room, staring at a point where she wasn't. A feeling of strange unease came in waves. Something was wrong. He took a step toward the bed, as if searching for something that might explain her behavior. Her jeans, tossed on the edge of the bed, still held warmth. He noticed something he probably shouldn't have. There was a strange mark on the skin of her thigh, just below her tank top. He bent over to see it. Red prints from someone else's palm. His hand hovered in the air, hesitant to touch. He tried to find a logical explanation, but the only thing that came to mind was still the same. Someone else's hands. An image flashed through his mind. Her body arching beneath someone else's palms, clutched in someone else's fingers. The picture was so vivid that he took an involuntary step backward, as if trying to escape those thoughts. The hum of the bathwater continued to fill the silence. She was there, very close by, and yet she seemed so far away. His mind was torn between two desires: to go to her, to ask her head on, to force an explanation, or to pretend he hadn't noticed. His heart pounded as if it demanded immediate action, but he didn't move from his seat. At work, Mark couldn't concentrate. His thoughts were far away from here. His fingers froze over the keyboard, where an unopened file was waiting to be finalized. It wasn't the screen in front of his eyes. He saw the smudges on her skin, the prints of someone else's hands. Who was that? He thought for the 100th time that morning. Just yesterday, he wouldn't have even allowed such thoughts. But now, everything that had happened over the last night, everything she hadn't said, it wouldn't leave him alone. Where? How? What? Each question pounded into his head like a hammer. Opening his mouth and asking would have been easier. But what if she lied? What if he misunderstood? Mark? A voice called out. He flinched, but immediately pretended nothing had happened. Standing in the doorway was Linda, his co-worker. She tilted her head, frowning her eyebrows slightly. Is everything okay? You've been sitting in the same place for an hour. Yeah, he lied. Everything's fine. She looked at him, but didn't say anything and left. Mark stared at the screen again. The letters were blending into an unreadable blur. He ran his hand over his face, tried to focus on the lines of the report. The words wouldn't form sentences. The morning coffee had long since lost its warmth. By lunchtime, thoughts of Jessica had completely taken over his mind. He saw them again. The red marks, the stranger's fingers clutching her skin. The picture he'd been completing himself only grew larger. Who is he? What? The clock on the monitor showed 1700 hours. The workday was coming to an end, but the work still hadn't been done. He shut down his computer, grabbed his jacket off the rack, and headed for the elevator, avoiding meeting his colleagues' eyes. All he needed to do was get home, get under the shower, and make himself forget for at least an hour. When he left the office, his boss, Harvey Bennett, was standing by the reception desk. Mark, Harvey called out, as always, loudly and with a smile. Mark didn't expect it and instinctively stopped. He sighed, swallowed his irritation, and turned to his superior. Good evening, he said briefly, hoping that would be the end of the conversation. But Harvey didn't leave. He stood there, jiggling his car keys on his finger and smiling strangely. How's your wife? He asked suddenly with a smile on his face, but there was nothing like interest in his voice. Mark frowned, but answered calmly. I'm fine, thanks. Harvey glanced at his watch as if pausing on purpose. His grin grew wider. I hope this experiment of yours was good for her. She was clearly enjoying every second of it. Everything inside Mark froze. What? He asked, his voice trembling. Harvey gave him a quick glance, as if assessing how he would take his words. I thought you said you'd had some interesting experiences. I think she took the right approach. It was quiet for a moment. Only the sound of a coffee machine running somewhere in the corner broke the tense pause. A memory flashed through Mark's mind. The red marks on her skin, the look in her eyes as she avoided his, her reply. It's fine. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't find the words. The world had narrowed down to what he was hearing now. Everything else ceased to exist. Just Harvey and those hints, that tone, that smile that made him want to knock his teeth out. Have a good night, Mark, Harvey said, leaving him with that phrase. Then he turned and walked confidently out of the office without looking back. When Mark left the office, he got into his car, but didn't start the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but his fingers trembled faintly. Harvey's words echoed in his head. Each word dug under his skin like shards of glass. The next day, he hoped it was all in the past, that Harvey had just decided to play a cruel game with him. But something inside told him it wasn't over. Mark noticed the changes almost immediately. At first, it was just little things, short pauses before tasks, Harvey's lingering gaze a little longer than usual, the same strange undertone in his voice. And it all seemed rather random. He was just thinking too much, imagining too much. That's what he told himself for the time being. But the next week, the delays began. Mark heard about it from the accountants. The bonuses were due on Thursday, but Friday morning brought no change to the account. When he decided to check with Linda, it turned out that it was only affecting him. That's odd, she said, checking the spreadsheets. Everyone else got it. Maybe there's some kind of mistake. He tried to ignore it. After all, sometimes there are glitches in the system. By late afternoon, however, it became clear that the error was not being fixed, and Harvey didn't seem to be in much of a hurry to solve it. Moreover, every time Mark tried to talk about it, he was interrupted by other tasks, urgent, pointless, requiring immediate attention. Mark felt the ground begin to shake under his feet. He couldn't tell exactly what Harvey was doing, but everything pointed to the same problem. This isn't an accident. This is pressure. The hardest moments came in the office cafeteria. Harvey loved to gather his coworkers around him, crack jokes, tell stories. Anything that once seemed harmless was now filled with hidden innuendo. Mark felt like Harvey was talking directly to him, even though he seemed to be addressing Linda or someone else. You know, sometimes life has these interesting twists and turns, he said, sipping his coffee. You never know who might surprise you. His colleagues laughed, but Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Those words weren't casual. They were addressed to him. It wasn't any easier at home. Jessica had started coming in later than usual again, explaining it was because of work or meetings with friends. But Mark noticed that she was avoiding conversation, avoiding stares, and her voice used to sound confident, soft, but now it was trembling. He tried to talk about it directly. What's going on? What do you mean? She asked with feigned surprise. You're not like you used to be. You're hiding something. She looked away, shook her head. You're imagining things. It's all right. But it wasn't all right. One night, he came home early from work. There was a stranger's car in the driveway. Mark didn't know who it was, but when the door swung open, Jessica stepped out of the cabin. She looked terrified. Harvey, sitting behind the wheel, waved to Mark through the window. It was almost a friendly hi. Mark didn't move. Jessica walked over to him. Her hands were shaking. He just gave me a ride home, she said. Her voice sounded weaker than usual, as if she was afraid that if she said one more word, the walls of the house would collapse. Mark stared at her without making a sound. He could see her chin quivering, her gaze lowered, her jacket wrapped around her, even though it was warm outside. But in her eyes, even in that avoidant look, he noticed something else. That something made everything inside him shiver. Mark heard the phone vibrate through the quiet breathing of a sleeping Jessica. He raised himself slightly on his elbows and looked at the screen of her cell phone lying on the bedside table. A thin beam of light cut through the semi-darkness of the room. He wasn't in the habit of looking at her cell phone, but that vibration in the night, that reminder that her voice had sounded different lately, pushed him forward. The screen flashed, and Mark had time to read the message line. Don't forget we know how to make each other happy, darling. A second, and everything that had been hidden in the depths of his mind came rushing out at once. He got out of bed, picked up her phone. His hands were shaking, but the only thought in his head was, it's him. It's Harvey. Mark couldn't stand still. He began pacing around the room, feeling the anger boiling up inside. He walked to the window, looking out at the dark street, but there was only one thing in front of his eyes. The red marks on her skin, her trembling voice, Harvey's smirk in the office. And now this message. The phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen. Jessica, are you awake? He turned and stared at her. She was sleeping peacefully, as if she hadn't the slightest twinge of remorse. Her hair was spread across the pillow, her lips slightly open. He wanted to wake her now, to break this dream, this pretense, to make her look him in the eye. Jessica, he called, his voice quiet but cold fury in it. She moved but didn't open her eyes. Jessica, he said louder, standing over the bed. Her eyelids fluttered and she rolled over on her side, as if she didn't realize he was near. Mark turned on the night light, the light hitting her face, and she finally opened her eyes. What? She mumbled, yawning. What's wrong? He silently held out his cell phone to her. Her gaze fell on the screen, and a moment later she froze. She started, but Mark didn't let her finish. Is that him? Harvey? Are you sleeping with him? His voice was low and hard. What do you mean? She pulled the blanket tighter, as if she were going to defend herself against his words. Don't lie to me, Jessica. Mark raised his hand, but didn't take a step forward. You fuck my boss? Do you keep doing it behind my back? No, she whispered, but her voice didn't sound confident. Mark stepped closer to the bed. Don't lie. I get it. You're trying to hide it, but I realized who you really are." His face was close to hers. He looked her straight in the eyes, but she avoided his gaze. Her voice broke. She looked away and bit her lip. He felt everything shatter inside. He had no doubts left. She couldn't look him in the eye. She couldn't explain why this man, his boss, was texting her like this. He had figured it all out. Jessica covered her face with her hands, and he just stood there, not moving, not knowing what to do next. The morning was cold and gloomy. Mark left the house earlier than usual. He felt tension in his whole body, from his temples to his fingertips. Jessica didn't say anything. She just sat in the kitchen, staring into her cup of coffee, unable to bear his gaze. When he arrived at the office, no one had gotten to their desks yet. The stairwell, the hallways, even the reception desk seemed deserted. But he knew Harvey was already there. Harvey was always the earliest to arrive. Mark swung open the door of the supervisor's office without knocking. Harvey, sitting behind his large desk, looked up and grinned slightly. He had a glass of tea in his hand. "Mark," he said quietly, as if greeting an old friend, "you've been active this morning." Mark stepped forward. All the trepidation, all the doubts he might have had before, were gone. He leaned over the table so that his face was close to Harvey's. "Listen to me," he said quietly, but with such force that each word cut the air. "You think you can use this against me? I don't give a damn. But I'll tell you what. If you don't leave her alone, I'll blow your career to hell. Guess who's handing the shareholders a report with your phony numbers today?" Harvey squinted. Another second, and there was no trace of smile on his face. "What are you trying to say?" Harvey's voice was steady, but there was a tinge of caution in it. Mark straightened, keeping his gaze on his companion. "I know about your machinations. Harvey, don't think you're the smartest. You've been leaving footprints. I see it every day when I sign your damn reports. If you think you can blackmail me, try it. We'll see who's worse off." They stood in silence, staring at each other as if in an unarmed duel. Harvey clenched his fists, but didn't say a word. "So," Mark continued, taking a step back, "leave her alone, or you'll know what it's like to lose everything." Harvey didn't say anything. He just stared at Mark, as if trying to figure out how serious he was. And Mark was more serious than ever. When Mark got home, Jessica was still sitting in the kitchen. Her eyes were red, and there was a second cup of coffee on the table in front of her. "It was a mistake," she whispered as soon as he walked in. "I thought I was just taking a chance, that it wouldn't change anything." Mark stopped in the doorway, looking down at her. She tried to meet his gaze, but couldn't stand it and lowered her eyes. "A mistake?" he repeated. "Do you think it can be fixed?" She sobbed quietly, covering her face with her hands. "I don't know how." Her voice shook. "I just don't know what to do now." Mark was silent. He didn't need to hear her excuses. He didn't need an explanation. He had already done everything he could. He knew Harvey wouldn't risk his career. Knew that Jessica was now realizing what she'd lost. "And I do," he finally said coldly. "I'll just take my chance." He picked up his laptop and retreated to the bedroom. Within minutes, all of his collected data had been sent to the corporate email accounts. Harvey's management now knew everything. Mark closed the laptop, leaned back in his chair, and took a deep breath. Everything he could do had been done. Now all that was left to do was wait for Harvey's career to collapse. He felt satisfaction, but it didn't bring relief. The emptiness inside remained. From the kitchen came Jessica's muffled sobs. Her shoulders jerked as he walked by, but he didn't even look in her direction. Mark picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His fingers stopped at a name he hadn't typed in a while. Then another. He pressed call. "Hi, Bella. Are you busy today?" His voice sounded steady, confident. "For you?" There was a smile in her voice. "Always available." "That's fine. Take a friend. Just one who likes to experiment." Interesting. We'll be there in an hour." Mark disconnected the call and sat down on the couch, poured himself a whiskey, and took the first sip. He waited. When the door opened, Jessica lifted her head from the table. There were two girls standing in the hallway. One was Bella, a redhead with long legs, bright eyes, and a cheeky smile. The other was Lena, a brunette with smooth thighs covered in tight jeans. They walked in without looking around, heading straight for the living room as if they'd been here before. "Wow," Bella said, shucking off her coat and exposing the deep cleavage of her breasts. "It's cozy in here." Lena grinned and sat cross-legged on the armrest of the couch. Jessica came out of the kitchen, a look of utter bewilderment on her face. Mark, her voice shook. What? He turned his head to her, completely calm. Are you serious? He took a sip of whiskey, leaning back relaxedly on the back of the couch. Why wouldn't I be? He raised his eyebrows. It's just an experiment, right? Jessica opened her mouth, but couldn't say anything. Bella grinned, stepped closer, and leaned over, placing her hand on his shoulder without taking her eyes off Mark. I think we're going to have fun, she whispered. Lena, sitting on the armrest, lazily ran her finger along the rim of her wine glass. You don't mind, do you, sweetheart? She turned to Jessica with feigned politeness. Jessica turned pale, her fingers frantically gripping the edge of the table. But Mark was no longer paying attention to her. Only one party was making the rules tonight, and that was him. The next morning, Jessica woke up, but Mark wasn't in bed. The kitchen was empty. The only sound in the house was the whirring of the old refrigerator. She reached for her cell phone, but couldn't find it. When she looked back, she saw it. Her phone was on the table, next to a folder. A strip of his handwriting was taped to the cover. Your copies. Please fill out and sign. Her heart plummeted somewhere downward when she opened the folder. It was divorce papers. Mark? Her voice was weak, but there was no response. She turned to the window and saw his car pulling away in the driveway. Jessica froze in place, clutching the folder to her chest. She knew there was nothing she could explain or change now. The very night they'd agreed to the experiment had been enough to ruin everything. She sat back in her chair, put her hand on the papers, and felt a tear slide down her cheek. She wanted to call out to him to rush to the car, but she knew it was too late. She had only one choice now, to sign the papers and start over from scratch. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.